A 2008 study found that 58% of people think Sherlock Holmes was a real guy. That's kind of wild when you think about it. But he's got nothing on some of the names on today's list. One person on here is celebrated as a national hero by an entire country that knows he never lived and loves him anyway. How does that even work? I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 icons the world believed but never existed. 25. Georges Psalmanazar. Georges Psalmanazar showed up in early 1700s London, claiming to be the first person from Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan, to ever visit Europe. He put together an entire alphabet, wrote a best-selling memoir about his homeland, and had scholars eating out of his hand for years. The man was a complete fraud. Just some French con artist who had never set foot anywhere near Asia. His Formosan language was gibberish he made up on the spot. His descriptions of Taiwanese customs were pure fiction. When people finally caught on, you'd think he would have disappeared in shame. Nope. He reinvented himself as a theological writer and spent the rest of his life surrounded by literary friends who thought his audacity was actually kind of impressive. 24. Taro Tsujimoto. The 1974 NHL draft dragged on forever, and Buffalo Sabres general manager Punch Imlach got bored. So, he submitted a draft pick for a player named Taro Tsujimoto from the Tokyo Katanas. The league recorded it. Newspapers printed it. Other teams probably took notes. None of them bothered checking whether Tsujimoto or the Tokyo Katanas were real, because they weren't. Imlach made up the whole thing as a prank to protest how tediously long the draft process had become. The Sabres eventually admitted the joke, and Tsujimoto's pick was voided. But hockey fans loved it so much that he became a cult legend anyway. To this day, his jersey still sells as a collector's item. 23. Nat Tate. Scottish novelist William Boyd had a theory about the art world in 1998, and he tested it in the most devious way possible. He dreamed up Nat Tate, a tragic abstract expressionist painter who supposedly destroyed most of his own work before ending his life young. Boyd wrote a fake biography with fabricated photographs and threw a book launch party in New York. Real art critics and gallery owners showed up. They talked about Tate's genius as if they'd always known about him. Some claimed to remember his work. A few said they had met him personally. Boyd wanted to see how many people would pretend to recognize a name rather than admit they'd never heard of someone. When the hoax was revealed, it embarrassed quite a few important figures and sparked a conversation about how easily cultural credibility gets manufactured. 22. J.T. LeRoy. The 90s literary scene had a new darling, and his name was J.T. LeRoy. This troubled teen writer was putting out novels about life on the streets that felt so raw and honest that famous people couldn't stop talking about him. Bono was a fan, so was Winona Ryder. The books were selling, the reviews were glowing, and nobody could get enough of this mysterious kid who had clearly lived through some serious stuff. Except there was no kid. A woman named Laura Albert had been writing it all from her apartment. She did the phone interviews herself using a different voice, and whenever J.T. LeRoy needed to show up in person, she sent her sister-in-law out in a blonde wig and oversized sunglasses. This went on for years. When reporters finally figured it out, Albert got hit with lawsuits and a whole lot of anger from people who felt tricked. Her defense was that she needed to hide behind someone else to get those words on the page. Whether that's a valid excuse or not depends on who you ask. 21. Otto Titzling. Someone had to invent the bra, and for years, trivia enthusiasts confidently credited Otto Titzling. The name sounds like a joke, because it was one. Otto Titzling first appeared in a 1971 humor book called Bust Up by Wallace Rayburn. The author dreamed him up along with a supposed rival named Philip de Brazier as a gag about trivial history. Nobody was supposed to take it seriously. But people started repeating the tale without realizing it was a parody. Teachers mentioned it in classrooms. Trivia books included it as fact. Even a song in the movie Beaches referenced Otto Titzling as if he were real. The actual history of bra development involves several real inventors, but none of them have names quite as memorable. 20. Ann Taylor. Walk into any shopping mall in America and you'll probably see an Ann Taylor store. The brand has been selling professional women's clothing since 1954, and customers have always assumed Ann Taylor was a real designer who started the company. She wasn't. There never was anyone named Ann Taylor involved in the business at any point. The company was founded by Richard Libeskind, who simply thought the name sounded approachable and trustworthy. It worked. Generations of shoppers have connected emotionally with a brand name after a person who never walked this earth, buying clothes from someone who was never someone to buy clothes from. 19. Sally Ann Thunder Ann Whirlwind. American folklore loved conjuring larger-than-life heroes, and Sally Ann Thunder Ann Whirlwind might be the wildest example. She first appeared in the Crockett Almanacs, a series of popular pamphlets published from 1835 to 1856 that turned the real Davy Crockett into a fictional superhero. The almanacs featured wild adventures, including tales about Crockett's wife, a woman so tough she could wrestle alligators, outshot thunder, and tame wild bears with a stern look. According to tall tales, she was just as tough as Davy was. Folk songs celebrated her adventures across the frontier. None of it was real. Sally Ann was pure invention. A composite figure who symbolized frontier spirit and female toughness in an era that mostly expected women to stay quiet in the background. Her tales were meant to entertain around campfires, not document actual history, but she became embedded in American mythology anyway. 18. Mingering Mike. Throughout the 60s and 70s, a man named Mike Stevens built something remarkable in his Washington home. He conjured an entire soul and funk career for a musician named Mingering Mike. Stevens hand-drew dozens of album covers with original artwork. He wrote out complete track listings and designed promotional material spanning years of releases that never happened. The only thing missing was actual music. No songs were ever recorded. The albums lived only as artwork and imagination. Decades later, someone discovered the collection at a flea market, and the art world took notice. Today, museums display the Mingering Mike collection as a fascinating example of outsider art and a fully realized fantasy. 17. Sid Finch. On April 1st, 1985, Sports Illustrated published an article about a mysterious New York Mets pitching prospect who could throw a fastball at 168 miles an hour. That's roughly 65 miles faster than anything ever recorded. His name was Sid Finch, and according to the article, he grew up in an English orphanage, studied yoga in Tibet, and couldn't decide between baseball and playing the French horn. Mets fans went absolutely wild. GMs from other teams called to ask about him. News networks sent reporters to spring training. Almost nobody noticed that the subheading spelled out Happy April Fool's Day using the first letter of each word. The magazine didn't admit to the prank until 2 weeks later. 16. Tony Clifton. Las Vegas in the 70s had no shortage of lounge singers, but Tony Clifton stood out for all the wrong reasons. He was abrasive, off-key, and weirdly confrontational with audiences who paid good money to be entertained. People weren't sure if he was a real performer having a very public meltdown or something stranger, and the truth turned out to be much stranger. Tony Clifton was a persona conjured by comedian Andy Kaufman, who insisted he be treated as a completely separate person with his own bookings and appearances. Sometimes Kaufman performed as Clifton. Sometimes his collaborator Bob Zmuda did. The act intentionally confused everyone about where performance ended and reality began, which was exactly the point Kaufman was making about celebrity and authenticity. 15. Jára Cimrman. The Czech Republic has a national hero, and the whole country knows he's fake. They love him anyway. Jára Cimrman started as a joke in the 60s. Two theater guys cooked him up as a satirical genius who supposedly did everything before everyone else. He gave Einstein the idea for relativity. He showed up at Kitty Hawk before the Wright brothers. He wrote plays that would have made Shakespeare jealous. Obviously, none of this happened, because Zimmerman never breathed a single breath. But that hasn't stopped the Czechs from running with it for over 60 years. There's a whole theater dedicated to him in Prague. Museums have exhibits about his life. When a radio station ran a poll in 2005 asking listeners to name the greatest Czech of all time, Cimrman won by a landslide, and the organizers had to throw out the results because you can't give that title to someone who doesn't exist. The whole country treats it like a long-running bit that nobody wants to end. Good luck explaining any of this to someone who's never been there. 14. Tokyo Rose. During World War II, American soldiers fighting in the Pacific gave a nickname to the English-speaking woman who broadcasted Japanese propaganda over the radio. They called her Tokyo Rose. But she wasn't one person. Multiple women did these broadcasts, and soldiers lumped them all together under a single mythical identity that captured their imagination. After the war, journalists and prosecutors focused on Iva Toguri, an American citizen who had been trapped in Japan when fighting broke out. She was convicted of treason and spent years in prison, even though her actual broadcasts were relatively harmless music programs with playful banter. She was eventually pardoned, but the legend of Tokyo Rose as a single seductive enemy voice persisted long after anyone figured out that she was always a collective fiction. 13. H. Rochester Sneath. Sometimes a prank is too perfect. An Englishman once dreamed up a headmaster named H. Rochester Sneath of the equally made-up Selhurst School, and then started sending formal letters to real prominent figures asking for donations, references, and various academic favors. The correspondence was written in perfectly pompous language, and several recipients responded as if Sneath was genuine. Nobody questioned whether this headmaster or his school actually existed because the tone felt so authentic. The letters eventually became a celebrated example of British satirical humor, demonstrating how easily authority and credibility can be simulated through confident writing and official-sounding letterhead. Sneath had no school, no students, and no existence whatsoever, but his correspondence fooled people who should have known better. 12. Nicolas Bourbaki. Academic mathematics operates by its own rules, and in the 20th century, a group of French mathematicians decided to bend them. They conjured Nicolas Bourbaki, a made-up mathematician under whose name they published rigorous textbooks covering set theory, algebra, and analysis. The work was legitimate and influential, but the author was completely fabricated. The collective persona allowed the group to collaborate while emphasizing ideas over individual credit. It also poked fun at academic conventions and the cult of personality that develops around certain scholars. Today, works published under the Bourbaki name are standard references in graduate programs worldwide. Students study theorems and proofs attributed to someone who never drew breath. 11. Juan Valdez. If you've ever purchased Colombian coffee, you've probably seen Juan Valdez. He's been the face of Colombian coffee exports since 1958, always depicted as a traditional farmer with his trusty mule representing quality and authenticity. Consumers worldwide assumed he was a real person, maybe a legendary grower whose family had been producing beans for generations. He wasn't. Juan Valdez was dreamed up by the National Federation of Coffee Growers of Colombia as a marketing figure. Multiple actors have portrayed him over the decades, but the man himself is pure invention designed to give the product a human face that consumers could trust. Billions of dollars worth of coffee have been sold under a name that belongs to nobody. 10. Lorna Doone. There's a region of England called Exmoor, where tourists sometimes go looking for the grave of Lorna Doone, the beautiful heroine of romance and tragedy. They won't find it, because she never walked this earth. Lorna Doone was a figure from an 1869 novel by Artie Blackmore, a literary creation set among real locations and local legends. The book was so vivid, and the heroine so compelling, that readers assumed she must have been based on a real woman. She wasn't. Blackmore blended history with imagination to craft a tale that felt authentic, and generations of readers have been convinced ever since that Lorna must have walked those moors at some point. Local tourism boards aren't exactly rushing to correct them. 9. Piotr Zak. In 1961, the BBC aired a composition by a promising young Polish avant-garde composer named Piotr Zak. Critics tuned in expecting innovation, but what they heard was a chaotic mess of random bangs, rattles, whistles, and other non-musical sounds. Reviews were mixed. Some praised the bold experimentation, while others dismissed it as garbage. Within weeks, the broadcaster revealed the truth. Piotr Zak never lived. The composition was a deliberate hoax put together by two producers to test whether critics could tell the difference between genuine avant-garde music and pure nonsense. The answer, embarrassingly, was that many could not. Give something a prestigious platform and foreign name, and people will find meaning in it, whether it's there or not. 8. Pecos Bill. American folklore needed a cowboy hero, so somebody made one up. Pecos Bill was supposedly raised by coyotes in the Texas desert and grew up to perform impossible feats like riding tornadoes and lassoing entire mountain ranges. The tale spread through schoolbooks, cartoons, and campfire gatherings until Pecos Bill became embedded in the American imagination as a genuine folk legend. The twist is that, unlike many folk heroes who evolve organically over centuries, Pecos Bill was largely a literary invention. Writers put him together in the early 20th century to fill a gap in Western mythology, and he became so popular that people forgot he was never real to begin with. Although I do enjoy eating the food at Pecos Bill at Magic Kingdom. Pretty good. They just changed the menu too. 7. Claude Émile Jean-Baptiste Litre. Every unit of measurement has an origin, and for the leader, someone decided to make up a backstory. Claude Émile Jean-Baptiste Litre was humorously presented in scientific circles as the person after whom the unit of volume was named. The joke caught on, and the tale spread through academic conversations as a bit of playful trivia. There is no historical record of any such person ever having lived. The leader's actual origins involve the metric system's development during the French Revolution, which is far less entertaining than a made-up scientist with a perfectly appropriate surname. But the fake namesake persists as an amusing example of how even people trained in rigorous methodology occasionally like to mess with each other. 6. Dr. Irving Joshua Matrix. Martin Gardner wrote about math for Scientific American for decades, and he had a knack for making numbers fun to read about. One of his best running gags was a guy named Dr. Irving Joshua Matrix, a so-called numerologist who kept popping up in Gardner's columns with increasingly ridiculous findings. Dr. Matrix would analyze whatever crossed his path. He'd look at a random license plate and explain how the numbers predicted the fall of Rome. He'd take a phone number and connect it to ancient prophecies. Every sequence meant something profound, or at least he could make it sound that way. That was the whole point. Gardner wanted to show how easy it is to dress up nonsense in fancy language and watch people nod along like it makes sense. The bit worked a little too well. Readers started writing in asking for Dr. Matrix's contact information. They wanted consultations. They wanted to hire him. Gardner had to keep reminding people that the guy was completely made up, which honestly just proved his point even better than the columns did. 5. Laozi. If you've ever heard someone talk about the Tao, or seen that black and white yin-yang symbol, you've bumped into the influence of Laozi. He's supposed to be the guy who started Taoism and wrote the Tao Te Ching, one of the most translated books in human history. His ideas have been shaping Chinese culture for over 2,000 years. But here's the problem. Nobody can actually prove he was a real person. The biographical details we have about him read more like legend than history. Some scholars think the Tao Te Ching wasn't written by one guy at all, but pieced together over generations by different contributors who never bothered signing their names. Others go further and argue that Laozi might just be a symbolic name that got attached to these teachings long after they were already floating around. The philosophy is real. The wisdom is real. The guy who supposedly came up with it all might not be. 4. The Yellow Emperor. Chinese civilization traces much of its cultural identity back to a ruler known as the Yellow Emperor, or Huangdi. According to tradition, he was a wise sovereign who unified early Chinese civilization while pioneering advances in tools, medicine, writing, and the calendar. Modern historians consider Huangdi largely mythological. The narratives represent symbolic accounts of technological and social development rather than the documented achievements of a verifiable ruler who once held power. Despite this scholarly consensus, the Yellow Emperor remains a powerful cultural icon. His supposed legacy illustrates how myth and history intertwine to shape national identity. Sometimes the legend matters more than whether the person behind it ever drew breath. 3. Sir Roger de Coverley. English literature gave us Sir Roger de Coverley, a kindly and eccentric country gentleman who became emblematic of 18th century English manners and morality. Essays describe his opinions on everything, from politics to fashion. Readers quoted his wisdom. His appearances accumulated admirers who felt they knew him personally. Sir Roger never lived outside the imaginations of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, who put him together for their daily publication, The Spectre, in 1711. They used him to comment on contemporary society with warmth and wit, and the readers grew so attached that many forgot he was entirely made up. 2. Datu Kalantiaw. For decades, Filipino schoolchildren learned about Datu Kalantiaw, a pre-colonial chieftain who supposedly wrote an ancient legal code in 1433. Monuments honored him. Textbooks included his tale. The legend became a source of national pride about the sophistication of Philippine civilization long before Spanish colonizers arrived. And the whole thing turned out to be a forgery. Historical investigation revealed that both the Code of Kalantiaw and his author were fabricated in the early 20th century by a forger named Jose E. Marco, who specialized in faking historical documents. There's no credible evidence Kalantiaw ever lived. The National Historical Commission of the Philippines officially declared the account fraudulent, but it took generations to correct the record. 1. Till Eulenspiegel. For our final entry, we're going to medieval Germany. Till Eulenspiegel was a wandering prankster whose whole deal was taking orders way too literally. If a baker told him to knead dough until sunrise, he'd do it all night and act confused when the baker got mad. If a nobleman gave him a vague command, he'd twist the words around until the nobleman ended up looking like a fool. Every joke had a target, usually someone with more money or status than sense. People ate it up for centuries, and the first printed collection of his pranks showed up around 1515. Historians have spent a lot of time trying to track down any evidence that this guy actually walked around medieval Germany, and they've come up completely empty. There are no records linking him to any real person, no grave sites, and nothing in any official documentation from that era. The best guess is that Till Eulenspiegel was never one person at all, but a patchwork of different trickster legends that got bundled together under one memorable name. Germans still use the name today when they want to describe someone with a mischievous streak. 500 years of fame, and the man behind it all probably never took a single breath. Humans love a good story so much that we'll believe just about anything if you tell it the right way. We built statues for people who weren't real. We bought coffee from a farmer who'd never picked a single bean. We mourned writers who turned out to be middle-aged women in wigs. And the wildest part is that most of us aren't even mad about it once we find out. We just shrug and move on to the next good story. If you want to keep this going, click here for 25 famous people who never actually existed. Like, subscribe, hit that bell, and I'll see you in the next one. I'm real, I promise.